In October of 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis was forced to surrender his army of nearly 7,000 troops to a combined American and French force following his defeat in the Siege of Yorktown. It was a significant victory that forced the British government to negotiate a final end to the American War for Independence. But that victory and that independence might never have come. A little-remembered event on New Year's Day the same year left Washington's Continental Army teetering on the brink of collapse. The New Year's Day 1781 mutiny of the Pennsylvania line deserves to be remembered. After the battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775, the fledgling United States hand was forced. There was no longer a possibility of a peaceful resolution between the colonies and the king. The Continental Congress voted to establish the Continental Army to work with the state militias on June 14, 1775. Pennsylvania played an outsized role in that army from the beginning. Military historian John B.B. Tussell Jr. wrote in his 1977 book, The Pennsylvania Line. On June 14th, Congress voted to raise 10 companies of riflemen, enlisted for 12-month service. 6 of these companies were to consist of Pennsylvanians. Recruitment was enthusiastic in Pennsylvania, which continued to provide a growing number of units to the new Continental Army, as well as equipping a militia that remained under the authority of the state government. The first 9 companies raised for the Continental Army were placed under the command of Colonel William Thompson, a veteran of the French and Indian War, and so were called Thompson's Rifle Battalion. More Pennsylvania units would be added over the course of the year. But the 12-month enlistment for Thompson's men expired on June 30th, 1776. By then, it had become obvious that the conflict was going to be of a longer duration, and 12-month enlistments were inadequate. On July 1st, 1776, the organization of the Continental Army evolved. Those of Thompson's men who re-enlisted now signed up for 2-year enlistments and were designated the 1st Pennsylvania Regiment. Further reorganization came in January of 1777. Historian Charles Stilla explains, a reorganization of the troops was then made. 13 regiments of infantry, besides some small bodies of cavalry and artillery, were enlisted in Pennsylvania directly for the Continental service for 3 years or the war. They were all at this time in General Washington's army, forming the Pennsylvania line. The Congress established a quota of the number of infantry regiments from each state, which together would comprise the Continental line. The regiments of each state would, however, constitute their own line. The distinction had to do with officers and promotion. In general, officers below the rank of brigadier general were only eligible for promotion within their own state's line. Thus, each state had a line. In April of 1777, Anthony Wayne, a colonel who had served in the Continental Army's unsuccessful invasion of Canada and had distinguished himself in a rearguard action at the June 1776 Battle of Trois-Rivières, and then commanded the troops at Fort Ticonderoga, was promoted to the rank of brigadier general and given command of the Pennsylvania line. The Pennsylvania line distinguished themselves in the difficult fighting in the fall of 1777 at the battles of Brandywine and Germantown, before going into winter quarters at Valley Forge, north of Philadelphia. Legend suggests that the winter was particularly difficult in 1777-1778, but that is not the case. In fact, the winter was rather mild, but the Continental Army faced a supply crisis, thus subjecting its men to sometimes desperate conditions. Charles Yorty III of the Pennsylvania State University Libraries explains, in the minds of most Americans, mythos surrounds the Revolutionary War. Practically all school children have heard of how Continental soldiers underwent unspeakable hardship for want of clothing and provisions, but persevered only to win the war against all odds. On this subject, the legend does justice to the facts. Washington fretted that the army couldn't withstand the conditions, writing to the Continental Congress on December 23rd. I am now convinced beyond a doubt that unless some great and capital change suddenly takes place in that line, this army must inevitably be reduced to one or other of these 3 things: starve, dissolve, or disperse in order to obtain subsistence in the best manner they can. Since the month of July, we have had no assistance from the Quartermaster General. For his part, Wayne wrote to Washington, I am not for a winter's campaign in the open field. The distressed and naked state of your troops will not admit of it. Issues of supply and pay would continue to vex the Continental Army, and the always desperate for money Continental Congress, responsible for that army. In many ways overwhelmed, in 1779, Congress decided to make maintenance of the troops the responsibility of the states. Yorty writes that the decision was intended to save money for an already tight-fisted populace who had little interest in paying taxes to maintain the army. But officers of the army had reservations about the new plan's promise. When states failed to meet their quotas, these fears proved legitimate, and mutinies followed. The mutinies of Continental Army troops are relatively rarely discussed, but they represented a very real threat to the Revolution. The first to occur was on January 1st, 1780. General William Heath wrote in his memoir, "Early in the morning, about 100 soldiers belonging to the Massachusetts Regiment of the West Point Garrison marched off with the intent to go home. They were pursued and brought back. Some of them were punished, the greater part of them pardoned." While the poor conditions and pay presumably added to the discontent, the issue was with the soldiers' enlistment. Having served 3 years, the soldiers believed that their enlistment had expired, while the army sought to keep them for the duration of the war. The soldiers read that part to mean whichever came sooner. The soldiers were reviewed on a case-to-case basis, and some were allowed discharges. But supply seems to have been the largest factor in another mutiny in May among the troops from Connecticut. Private Joseph Plum Martin of the 8th Regiment of the Connecticut Line wrote in his journal, "The men were now exasperated beyond endurance. They could not stand it any longer. They saw no alternative but to starve to death or break up the army, give all up and go home." This was a hard matter for the soldiers to think upon. They were truly patriotic. They loved their country, and they had already suffered everything short of death in its cause. And now, after such extreme hardships, to give up all was too much. But to starve to death was too much also. What was to be done? Here was the army, starved and naked, and there their country sitting and expecting the army to do notable things while fainting from sheer starvation. All things considered, the army was not to be blamed. Reader, suffer what we did, and you will say so too. At least 2 regiments of the Connecticut line seemed determined to leave, and the Pennsylvania line was called to arms to prevent them. The Connecticut troops dispersed, and the leaders of the mutiny were arrested. The mutiny was cause for real concern. Philip Schuyler, who had served as a general in the Saratoga campaign before resigning to serve in the Continental Congress, wrote to the governor of New York, "A dangerous mutiny has taken place in a Connecticut brigade. The soldiery insisted on returning home. It is for the present quelled, but we have too much reasons to apprehend that it will show itself soon and more seriously, unless provisions arrive." The website of Fort Stanwix's National Monument explains that the various pleas must have helped. Some food did reach the camp. Washington wrote to the President of Congress on May 28th. "The troops were served yesterday with allowances of meat by the arrival of some pork from Trenton, and 30 cattle came in from Connecticut in the evening. 16 were left at West Point. Some cattle also have just reached camp from Pennsylvania." There is disagreement over the role that the Pennsylvania line played. While some contend that the threat from the Pennsylvania troops is what broke up the mutiny, other accounts suggest that it was an officer, Colonel Walter Stewart of the Pennsylvania line, who reasoned with them, telling them, "You Connecticut troops have won immortal honor to yourself by the winter pass, by your perseverance, patience, and bravery, and now you're shaking it off at your heels," and offering to speak to their officers himself. But Martin offered a more concerning perspective, writing that the Pennsylvania troops, when informed of the situation, planned to join in the mutiny. Their officers needed no further hinting. The troops were quickly ordered back to their quarters, from fear that they would join in the same song with the Yankees. Martin seems to have been correct that the Pennsylvania men were near mutiny themselves. Yorty writes that on the evening of January 1st, 1781, soldiers of the 11th Regiment of the Pennsylvania line dined and drank at a noisy New Year's celebration. Many men were enlisted for 3 years of the duration of the war and considered their enlistments over, although the officers reasoned that the duration of the war encompassed any length of time. It is not clear when they decided to mutiny or such a deliberate decision was actually made. Likely, the collective grievances of the men were enough to give them over to a snowballing disorder. At first, the rowdiness was attributed to Captain Joseph McClellan of the 9th Pennsylvania Regiment wrote in his journal, "The men drinking. They'd drawn a half-pint of liquor this day." But the situation was somewhat more than that, and the men of the 11th Regiment started parading with their arms, and then took the regimental artillery. The action turned bloody as the men attacked officers who were trying to restore order. McClellan writes, "Captain Biting, who was shot through the body and soon died. Captain Tolbert was badly wounded." It seems that the men of the 5th and 9th Regiments did not want to join, but McClellan writes they were threatened by others. If they did not move off, they would turn the artillery on them. Colonel Stewart's 2nd Regiment was forced to go along at bayonet point. Steele writes that General Wayne at first drew his pistols, only to be confronted by 100 bayonets. The men declaring, "We love you, we respect you, but you are a dead man if you fire. Do not mistake us, we are not going to the enemy. On the contrary, were they to now come out, you would see us fight under your orders with as much resolution and alacrity as ever." Wayne wrote to Washington, "Dear General, it is with pain I now inform your Excellency of the general mutiny and defection which suddenly took place in the Penna line between 9 and 10 o'clock last evening. Every possible exertion was used by the officers to suppress it in its rise, but the torrent was too potent to be stemmed." Of the mutinies of the previous year, the mutiny by the Pennsylvania line was most dangerous. The entire Pennsylvania line had thrown off their officers, and not only were they threatening to walk away, there was a real concern that they may attack Philadelphia or defect to the British. Washington was concerned that the mutiny would spread, writing in a letter to members of Congress and state governors that the aggravated calamities and distresses that have resulted from the total want of pay for nearly 12 months, the want of clothing at a severe season, and not unfrequently the want of provisions, are beyond description. The circumstances will now point out much more forcibly what ought to be done than anything that can possibly be said by me on the subject. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Wayne asked the men to assign a sergeant from each regiment to represent their grievances. Pennsylvania sent Joseph Reed, an Army veteran and president of the Pennsylvania Supreme Executive Council, essentially the state governor, to negotiate along with Wayne. The men of the Pennsylvania line had a particular reason to complain. Not only had they faced issues of supply, and many had served the 3 years in which they believed they had enlisted, but pay was particularly poor for the Pennsylvanians, and pay was in arrears, and many had received no pay except for a $20 bounty that they received when enlisting 3 years earlier. And new recruits were getting bounties that, Trussell notes, greatly exceeded anything the men already in the service had received. The demands listed by the Committee of Sergeants were, generally, that the men who had served their 3 years be paid their full bounty, and all pay that was in arrears, be provided winter clothing and provisions, and that nobody be punished for the mutiny. The Committee for Congress in Trenton was in a difficult position, as Yorty notes. The consensus was that they could not use force to end the mutiny. New Jersey's citizens and soldiers sympathized with the Pennsylvanians, as did the Pennsylvania militia. But negotiation seemed possible. Trussell writes, the men were not defecting to the enemy. They wanted the discharges to which they believed themselves entitled. Some of them wanted to go home, but a considerable number merely wanted the opportunity to re-enlist under the more liberal current terms. But British General Sir Henry Clinton had caught wind of the mutiny and sent men to negotiate as well, hoping to get the Pennsylvania line to defect to the British. The mutineers arrested the 2 agents he sent, and they became something of a bargaining chip with Congress. Yorty writes, Wayne desperately wanted them executed, which would show the Pennsylvanians' loyalty to their cause, but the sergeants preferred a compromise. The Board of Sergeants would retain custody of them until they further discussed the issue. With little choice, Pennsylvania gave in to the demands. Still writes that the agreement came after a deal of peaceful and temperate discussion between the soldiers and President Reed. Trussell writes, after some weeks of haggling, the discharges were granted. Yorty writes that as most men lacked enlistment papers, they were allowed to give an oath of their time served. As part of the deal, the Pennsylvania men handed over the 2 British agents, who were hanged as spies. The loss was significant, Trussell writes. By January 29th, over half the men of the Pennsylvania line had left the service. Even with re-enlistments, there were no more than 1,150 men remaining to man the 6 regiments of infantry. Yorty writes, it was a substantial loss in manpower for the Army, but it was probably the best possible resolution to the crisis. The peaceful resolution of the Pennsylvania Line mutiny did not put an end to problems for the Continental Army, which continued to face various mutinies throughout the rest of the war, and not always with such peaceful resolution. When the same January the New Jersey line attempted to mutiny, Washington quickly put the mutiny down and executed the ringleaders, and Anthony Wayne also executed men when there was a threat of a second mutiny among the Pennsylvania Line over pay. In 1783, the officers of the Continental Army threatened to mutiny over pay in the Newburgh Conspiracy, which was only put down by the personal exhortations of George Washington. And in June of 1783, 500 members of the Continental Army mutinied and held Congress hostage in Philadelphia. Washington had sent 1,500 troops to quell the disturbance. Now, throughout all of this, the troops maintained their loyalty to the American cause. They merely wanted, as Yorty put it, what the government owed them. But the mutiny of the Pennsylvania line showed how precarious the cause of the American Revolution was. Had the mutiny done more damage, the victory at Yorktown might have been impossible, and the United States may never have won its independence. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. Come join me, the history guy, and other lovers of history on a tour of the greater Philadelphia area October 3rd to the 6th, 2025. We'll start off at Gettysburg Battlefield. We'll go to Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell, the American Revolution Museum, and tour the notorious Eastern State Penitentiary. It's going to be a lot of fun with people who also love history, and you'll get to know me personally, the history guy. And you can sign up with the link in the description, but space is limited, so sign up today.